Friends, I am back again now with this new chapter on the physiology of thermal sensation. The thermal sensation is being dealt in many textbooks along with the pain sensory modality. Thus, there is no comprehensive aspect regarding this particular sensory modality. In this discussion, I would like to give a comprehensive outline of the thermosensation in our body. As we see the sensation or any sensory modality, we suddenly come back with the basic aspect or basic question: what are the receptors? For the thermal sensation, there are two sets of receptors, one located peripherally and another located centrally. The receptors located peripherally detect the thermal changes in the environment surrounding us, and these receptors are slowly adapting receptors, and they are very sensitive to the change in the temperatures. Then only we can detect the thermal sensation as thermal sensation. There are two types of receptors peripherally: warm receptors and cold receptors. For both of them, the free nerve endings are the receptors. In case of warm receptors, they are densely present in the warm spots. These warm spots are present in the lumbar and gluteal regions and on the back. That is why whenever there is a sensation of a warmth, you will see in these areas there is a greater feeling. The baseline firing of these receptors is around 38 degrees Celsius, that is our body temperature. And any increase above this would increase the firing rate. These receptors, the warm receptors, are carried by unmyelinated C fibers. In case of cold receptors, they are also called end bulb of Gauss, named after a German scientist. They are densely packed in cold spots. In our body, there are more cold spots than the hot spots or the warm spots. So these cold spots are distributed ventrally and dorsally, that means the chest, shoulder, and the legs. Same pattern on the back, they are densely packed. More on the flexor side of the extremity, and then the extensor. These receptors are sensitive between the ranges of 10 and 32 degrees Celsius. Baseline firing is around 32 degrees Celsius and they are carried by A delta fibers. There are central receptors which are located in the medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. These are also central warm receptors and cold receptors. Let us look into the characteristics of these warm and cold receptors. On the left hand side we have mentioned as heat. It's a warm receptor. It has been expressed with TRPV1 channels, that is transient receptor potential vanillide 1. Also it is been invested with non-TRPV1 channels. These non-TRPV1 channels include TRPV3 and TRPV4. If you are looking back about the temperature sensitivity of these two receptors, the TRPV1 detects the temperatures greater than 42 degrees Celsius, whereas non-TRPV1 they sense the temperatures between 27 and 42 degrees Celsius. In addition, there are other channels which are not shown on the warm receptors, that is ATP sensitive purine receptors. So these P2X3 channels, they are also sensing the warm sensation. Coming back to the cold, the cold channel is TRPM8. This TRPM8 is a transient receptor potential menthol. Menthol is the agonist there. The version, that means it's the isoform of the 8 isoform. And TRPM8 is sensitive to the temperatures below 25 degrees Celsius. So that means the temperature, when it comes down 25, we start feeling cold from this receptor. You have on the top non-TRPM8 receptors or channels. These non-TRPM8 channels include transient receptor potential anchoring channels, TRPA channels. They are sensitive to the temperature range below 17 degrees Celsius. The anchorin is a molecule present in the garlic and cinnamon. And there is another non-TRPM8 channel is a TRPV3. It is sensitive to camphor, and this is sensing the temperatures 33 degrees Celsius or lesser. In addition to these ligand gated channels, we have the potassium channels and sodium channels. The TRAC, these are potassium channels. Also we have 2,4 potassium channels, and we have sodium channels, especially NAV 1.8. The description of these various channels on the warm and cold receptors are tabulated here. The data is taken from Dakai et al. 2006. I briefly read about the table. TRPV1, the temperature range greater than 42 degrees Celsius. The capsaicin is an agonist and their sensation leads to warm and then the pain. TRPV4, it is a normal innocuous range 27 to 42 degrees Celsius. The 4-ball esters are the agonists and it is a innocuous warm sensation. The P2X3 channels, these are natural agonists is ATP and they detect the warmth. These effect is heat. Besides this, there are other TRP channels who detect the changes above 50 degrees Celsius, but they are mostly noxious. Coming back to the cold aspect, we have TRP V3. The temperature range is 33 degrees Celsius. Camphor is the agonist. It is a mild cool. TRPM8, it is less than 25. Menthol is an agonist. And the feeling is, the effect is cold. Then TRPA1, that is 𝐴𝐴NCARIN, that is allicin present in garlic and cinnamon, detects changes lesser than 17 degree and it produces a cold sensation as well as the cold sensation becoming noxious, that is a pain sensation. So then we have a TREC potassium channel, sodium potassium ATPase, and NAV 1.8. These are, that's a sodium channel. So they detect the cold. Now there is one aspect, that means innocuous thermal sensation, that is a purely thermal sensation, how this becomes changed to a noxious response. Hot temperatures above 42 degrees Celsius, that is a noxious range, activate TRPV1 channels and TRPV2 channels. TRPV1 is also activated by the H ions and by the capsaicin. The TRPV2 has a higher activation threshold, that is, it will be activated at temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius. The innocuous warm temperatures are sensed by will activate TRPV3 and TRPV4 channels. The cool and the cold temperatures activates primarily the TRPM8, that's menthol, and TRPA1, that is a painful stimulus, 𝐴𝐴NCARIN. The TRPA1 activation temperature is lesser than 70 degrees Celsius and produce a painfully cold sensation. Pattern of activity of the thermoreceptors is given in this graph. This is taken from the guidance textbook. The solid blue line indicates the cold receptor activity at different temperatures. The basal activity of these, if we start thinking about, so that means at 38 degrees or so they are, it's a bell-shaped curve, you can see they are minimal. Somewhere around 32 degrees there is a basal activation, because though the core temperature may be 38, the skin temperatures is usually lesser than that 38 degrees Celsius. So normally the basal activity of these receptors, the cutaneous receptors, that is the cold receptors, is basal activity is around 32 degrees Celsius. And as the temperature drops from 32 degrees further up to 24 or 25, there is a gradual increase in the discharge pattern. And the temperatures below 25 or 24, the discharge is decreasing, and even it is greater than the resting level. And somewhere around 15 degree, there is another channel is getting activated, that is the noxious cold channel. You can see in the dotted line, and that gets activated, and you will see the dotted line increases the discharge of the noxious cold sensation as the temperature falls further. When it reaches 0 or this is maximal, and that would produce a very cold response. That means you will have those responses which you have in freezing temperatures. If you are coming back to the warm, dotted red lines are the response pattern, discharge pattern of the warm receptors. Normally 38 degrees is the basal level of activity, that is our body temperature. As the temperature increases, the discharge in these receptors increases, peaks somewhere around 42 degrees Celsius, and above 42 degrees their discharge pattern starts decreasing. Again, a peculiar bell-shaped curve. You can look here somewhere around 45 degrees, the solid red line, that indicates the activation of the noxious heat sensation, the painful heat sensation. And this is TRPV2 is being active, TRPV1 is being activated now, and that would increase the discharge. And as it comes to 50, TRPV2 is activated, and that would increase it further. So you have the sensations of pain, the hot and pain is happening. This is the behavior of the receptors. Needless to repeat these observations, but quickly I go through the warm receptors carried by the C fibers. They reach the dorsal root ganglion, relayed in the dorsal lamina 1 and 2, whereas cold receptors carried by the A delta fibers, they are relayed in the dorsal root neurons, lamina 1, 3 and 5. However, as these fibers, C or A delta fibers, when they reach the spinal cord in the dorsal horn, they ascend and descend up for the 2 to 4 segments, and they form what is called a Leisser's tract, intersegmental tract. And finally they relay in the respective laminae as mentioned. Second order neurons originating from the dorsal horn lamina of 1, 2 and 5. They cross to the opposite side in the spinal cord and ascend as lateral spinothalamic tract. The fibers of the lateral spinothalamic tract relay in the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. From here, the third order neurons originate. These axons of these neurons terminate in the parietal cortex, somatosensory area 1, representing the part of area 312. Further, the signals are relayed to somatosensory area 2 and somatosensory association area, that is posterior parietal area 5 and 7, and also to the limbic cortex for behavioral responses to the sensory modality, that is the thermal changes. This is a standard description. Going further, you can see the distribution, whatever coming from the ventroposterolateral nucleus of thalamus. There is a pattern in the somatosensory area 1, and that is forming the homunculus as for the other sensory modalities of the body. Only one thing I want to highlight here: the distribution or proportion of the distribution is proportional to the functional significance of the particular modality of sensation. That rule is followed. Leaving this homunculus, you can look at that and you can see you can make your own feeling about. So that means that there is a greater representation of the entire arm, face, and lips and tongue. But if you are looking at the cold spots and hot spots, they are located in the trunk, the anterior aspect or posterior aspect, gluteal regions. They are lesser represented if I were to talk about their representation. A question will arise when we talk about the VPL cortical projections, the ventroposterolateral nuclear projections from thalamus to the cortex. This projection will provide the discriminatory component of this sensation, but this would not explain the various important manifestations associated with the thermal sensation. For this, you require an additional support from the important thermoregulatory centers in the body, especially the hypothalamus. So now there are connections to hypothalamus and the reticular system, and there are connections to the limbic system that would bring about the thermal related autonomic and behavioral responses. To fit or to look into this aspect, now we can make the pathways as this. That means the fibers in the lateral spinothalamic tract, this you can see the green line, relays into the medullary reticular nucleus on one side, then it relays into the parabrachial nucleus, that is between the junction of the pons and midbrain, and also gives collaterals to the periaqueductal gray, as it is being shown for other nociceptive impulses. Now from the parabrachial nucleus, the impulses change or reach the other component of the limbic system. The main lateral spinothalamic tract reach VPL and relay into the somatosensory cortex. The parabrachial component now gives information to the medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. That is one. The reticular system, that is a medullary and a pontine or midbrain reticular system, it relays into the intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus and also the reticular nucleus of the thalamus for arousal response. The parabrachial component are relayed into the medial preoptic nucleus of hypothalamus, amygdala, cingulate cortex, insular cortices for producing all the behavioral responses. Expanding the parabrachial nuclear relays further, first the information coming from the parabrachial nucleus relays into the preoptic nucleus. As I mentioned earlier, the preoptic nucleus also contains the central cold and warm receptors. Now it is at this point the peripheral inputs and the central inputs are put together and their modalities are processed accordingly. The medial preoptic nucleus provides excitatory inputs to the intermediolateral column of the medulla, which descends down to the sympathetic neurons in the lateral column of the spinal cord. And these particular projection is special for the pseudomotor activity, that is for the sweating. That is a specialized preoptic nuclear activity is activating the pseudomotor activity. Then preoptic nucleus also provides inputs, that means the efferents from the preoptic nucleus reach dorsal medial hypothalamus, dorsal medial nucleus of the hypothalamus and posterior nucleus of the hypothalamus. And they modulate the inputs of the intermediolateral column sympathetic activity, that is sympathetic tone, the vasoconstrictor tone, and sympathetic activity supplying the erector pili muscles, that means the hair erections, and also excite the preganglionic to the adrenal medulla and release of adrenaline that will activate the brown adipose tissue for generating extra heat. That's called non-severing thermogenesis. The posterior hypothalamus, which projects to the reticulospinal tract, descending reticulospinal tract, and that reaches to the spinal gamma motor neuron, that would try to make this severing mechanism, increase the muscle tone and the muscle activity. The muscle activity, voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary means you are trying to involve yourself in activity or not involve, or the other components. The parabrachial nucleus relays into amygdala, that will be one of the important nucleus in the limbic system. From there it will reach the cingulate cortex and the insular cortex. And these inputs to the various limbic areas produce the behavioral changes as required. Just trying to put this, taking one aspect, the skin, the blue circle and red circle represent the medial preoptic nucleus, And we have a different type of neurons there, warm receptors projecting on the cold receptor C, and we have the indifferent receptor I. There are three type of neurons there. The warm receptors, when it is activated by the thermal inputs from the skin and the peripheral side, it will activate the central warm receptors of the medial preoptic nucleus, and that would go to the IML and increase the pseudomotor activity. You can see the discharge given on the top graph. Increase in discharge as they are stimulated. Now these warm receptors are these neurons, they have inhibitory effect on the cold receptors. What these cold receptors are doing, these cold receptors, when they are activated, they would try to increase the production of heat and also try to retain the heat, so that there is a calorigenesis and calorie loss is prevented. Like vasoconstriction, piloerection, brown adipose tissue activation, gamma motor neuron activity, severing, and all those things is produced. So now these warm receptors located there in the blue ring, they would inhibit the cold receptors, so that because of the warm sensations, these activities generated by the cold receptors is suppressed. You may get the suppression of the whatever the calorigenesis or heat generating mechanism. If you look at the eye neurons, these eye neurons, when they are activated, there is no change in the activity of either of the heat. Especially these eye receptors are projecting onto the cold receptors. If we consider the other way around, when we are exposed to the skin cold receptors, they reach the cold receptors, that is the medial preoptic nucleus, that would suppress the warm receptors there on the top and excite the cold receptors. And now these excitation of the cold receptors enhance the heat generating mechanism, heat conserving mechanism, and produce all those effects, that is vasoconstriction, piloerection, the activation of the brown adipose tissue, gamma motor neuron activity, and severing. At the same time, as it is inhibiting the warm receptors, the heat loss mechanism is suppressed. So this is the overall the activity of the warm and cold receptors. If we come back trying to see what I have narrated in that picture, now I quickly go through it. C fibers relay in a dorsal horns and reach the lateral spinothalamic tract. From the lateral spinothalamic tract, the collaterals reach the parabrachial nucleus, and the main thing will reach the thalamus to the VPL. The VPL relays into the somatosensory area. The parabrachial nuclear output relay into the preoptic nucleus of hypothalamus. This output from the preoptic nucleus, the medial preoptic nucleus, excites the pseudomotor fibers, increases the sweating, that produces the heat loss. The medial preoptic nucleus, through dorsomedial nucleus of hypothalamus and the posterior hypothalamic nuclei, inhibits the medullary sympathetic neurons to decrease the vasoconstrictor tone and piloerection, that is the heat conservation, or to facilitate the heat loss mechanisms. That means it's not to generate a new heat. Sympathetic tone to the adrenal medulla is decreased, the brown adipose tissue activity diminishes, so that no extra heat is generated. Reticulospinal projections to gamma motor neuron decreases. There is a decreased muscle tone, decreased muscle activity, and there is no severing. So that type of heat conserving mechanism is operated. Besides this, the parabrachial nucleus projects onto the limbic areas, the amygdala, cingulate and insular cortex, provides the behavioral responses like the person looks for a shelter because it is warm, he wants to go to a shaded area or a cool area. Overall, his activity pattern is diminished. He wants to lazy out, he feels drowsy, and he feels even sleepy. He has been activated to drink cold water or cold fluid, and he has a craving for those special cold desserts like ice cream or fruits or any of those behavioral things. Also, this will have an effect, the increased temperature have an effect on the appetite center and diminishes the appetite. So that means a decreased food intake automatically decreases the metabolic activity. In addition to this, the person has preferences for a clothing pattern. He wants to have the loose, airy clothings and does not want to have those warm clothings which he was using in winter. And he wants to spread out, and he wants to have a more surface is exposed for evaporation. And even other this thing, he may now look for a swimming pool or a beach, trying to have a recreational facility in that context. On the other hand, the responses to cold receptors, you can just see there, they are carried by the A delta fibers, ascend as a lateral spinothalamic tract, give collateral to parabrachial nucleus, in addition to the path to the thalamus, that is through the ventroposterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, and then it will give to the somatosensory area to tell about the particular discriminative aspect of the cold. Parabrachial nucleus relates into the pre-optic nucleus of hypothalamus and dorsal medial nucleus and posterior hypothalamic nucleus. Medial pre-optic nucleus output inhibits the pseudomotor activity, hence there is no sweating, because now it is cold, there is no sweating. Now the medial pre-optic nuclear output via dorsomedial and posterior hypothalamic excites medullary neurons to produce vasoconstriction or increase sympathetic tone. That means there is an increased the blood. That means there is a vasoconstriction, and then there is a piloerection. Piloerection means there are goosebumps, the formation, that is the erector pili muscle is being activated, that produces extra heat. It also increases the sympathetic tone of the adrenal preganglionic sympathetic activity of supplying the adrenal medulla, and that would release adrenaline, and this adrenaline activates the brown adipose tissue, and that produces a non-severing thermogenesis. Adrenaline as such enhances the glucose metabolism by itself. The medial pre-optic nuclear activity via the posterior hypothalamic nuclei increases the reticulospinal gamma motor neuron activity, which in turn increases the muscle tone and muscle activity, and also brings in about severing mechanism. The parabrachial projections also reach the limbic areas. These limbic areas include amygdala, cingulate gyrus, and the insular cortex, and provide behavioral changes. Now the behavioral changes in response to cold, or the curling up, looking for warmer place, maybe the heating units or bonfire or whatever. As such, the activity of the person is increased. He is indulging in a sports activity and a non-sports activity, so that he increases the metabolism. There is increased appetite. He consumes a lot of food, and especially the proteinaceous food, and that protein molecules, as such, the protein in the diet produces what is called a specific dynamic action that produces extra calorie than what that is assigned for the protein. That is called a specific dynamic action. In addition, the behavioral components such as craving for hot drinks like the coffee, chocolate, the soup, whatever, and even the hot food. And he tries to prefer the warm clothings and the coverings, the blankets or the quilts. These are the response to cold receptor, in response to cold receptors. To summarize, warm and cold receptors are present in the skin areas and are carried by the unmyelinated C fibers and thinly myelinated A delta fibers. They relay in dorsal hot neurons, layers 1, 2, and 5. Axons of these neurons cross to opposite side as sent as lateral spinothalamic tract along with the main fibers. Lateral spinothalamic tract, while reaching the VPL, also give collaterals to the pontomedullary and midbrain reticular system, and one of the area is the parabrachial nucleus. They give a collaterals. The parabrachial nuclear relays into the medial preoptic nucleus of hypothalamus and dorsomedial nucleus of hypothalamus and posterior hypothalamic nuclei in turn. The parabrachial nucleus also gives input to the limbic system. VPL relays localizes, give characteristics of thermal sensation, that is a discriminatory component. Reticular and parabrachial connections through the intralaminar or reticular nuclei of the thalamus give a cortical arousal response. The medial preoptic nucleus of hypothalamus integrates the peripheral and central components of the thermal sensations. Also, it will, in association with the dorsomedial and posterior hypothalamic nucleus, modulate the sympathetic activity for sweating, vasoconstriction, vasodilatation, piloerection, voluntary and involuntary muscle activity, activation of brown adipose tissue as required. The parabrachial projections reach the limbic system, amygdala, cingulate gyrus, insular cortex, provide behavioral changes as required. Thank you. Hope this has covered the entire aspect of the thermal sensation. The next lecture I would be coming with the physiology of pain sensation. Meanwhile, I am giving some assignments for your own evaluation, and you try to do this. There are some questions and you can just attempt them for self-evaluation. Thank you very much.